Hello and welcome to ICTfE Education's interview series covering hot topics for teachers and schools across the primary and secondary sectors. My name's Sarah Underwood and I'm the editor at ICT for Education, I should say. Today I'd like to welcome Miles Berry from Roehampton University to share his insight into how schools continue to deliver computing lessons during lockdown. Miles, coming to you, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work.
Okay, it's lovely to be here, Sarah. It really is. I'm Miles Berry. I'm Principal Lecturer in Computing Education at the University of Roehampton. I'm running secondary teacher training programs for people who want to become computer science teachers. I also work on the university's digital media degree, which is great fun. And Roehampton let me go and get involved with lots of other interesting projects. So I serve on the board of Computing at Schools and the National Centre for Computing Education. I was part of the team who drafted the programs of study for computing. So lots of other things that I get involved with.
Okay, thanks, Mel. So these questions are not going to be a challenge at all for you. So let's start with how important is it for teachers to continue to teach computing through lockdown? It's not easy, I'm sure, but how important is it?
I think the first thing I'd want to say is it's really important that their pupils continue to learn computing through lockdown. Yes, they're using loads and loads of digital technology, much more so now in this weird period than they probably were before we went into this lockdown. So lots of opportunities to make use of digital technology. But that doesn't really mean that we shouldn't be developing their understanding of these things. Yes, they're using it, but they also ought to have some understanding of what it does, how it works, how the internet gets their images onto their teacher's screen and their teacher into their rooms onto their screen, and how all of this work moves across the internet. All of this is part of that understanding that should sit behind this digital skills, which I think we are seeing a lot of use made of at the moment. My point about learning, I think, is an important one, that there are so many opportunities during this period for young people to be learning perhaps a little bit more independently than they would have done in a traditional classroom setting. And there are plenty of opportunities for teachers to make use of that flexibility that we have at the moment. Yes, directing work, but perhaps not teaching in the same sense as before. So yeah, to answer your question, of course, computing remains important. The entitlement to a broad and balanced education, preparing them for the opportunities, responsibilities, experiences of later life doesn't change just because we're delivering education by different means now.
Okay, obviously that is important, but for teachers it really is quite a challenge to teach both in school and into the home at the same time. How would you sort of recommend they do this, all at the same time or separately, different programs? How have you seen this done well?
I think schools have figured this out for themselves incredibly well. And, you know, a lot of this is going to be dependent on the particular context. If you've got a lot of pupils in those vulnerable and key worker categories in school, then your approach is going to be really quite different to if they're just a tiny minority of the pupils you're working with. So it's very hard to say this is the best way to do it. Teachers and schools figuring out this for themselves seems to have been the pragmatic way of getting really quite a good approach to this in the present circumstances. So what we're seeing working well is this sort of live lesson thing of the teacher with their computer teaching a whole group of children who are joining for some sort of remote lessons. This feels very, very similar to what they would be doing in the classroom. Yes, it's mediated by screens, but where you've got good internet connectivity, where most of the pupils have got good access to technology at home, running something which approaches a school timetable, but by remote live delivery seems to be really very effective. Other places are going for a more hybrid model where the focus perhaps is on the children who are there still in the classroom and teaching them as you would a normal class, but allowing other pupils to join that remotely. I think this puts a lot of pressure on teachers of trying to balance those two audiences, of paying attention to the Zoom call or the Teams or the Meet or the whatever alongside the children who are physically present there in the room. And that sort of divided attention is not an easy thing to do. And the third option is this provision of lots of remote activities, or provision of activities. So here are some videos to watch, here is some work to do. I think a blend of that and possibly the first or the second approach seems to be working well for teachers. It's balancing the workload there and giving pupils some more chance to be learning independently, learning autonomously as they're getting on with engaging online activities.
That's great. And bearing those thoughts in mind, what kinds of tools and techniques can schools, teachers be using that do support both the teachers and the young students?
I think it's worth focusing on a small number of tools and using them really very well. We have seen teachers throwing everything, including the kitchen sink, into Zoom calls or remote teaching provision of using this tool and using that tool. I think that confuses a lot of pupils. It increases the cognitive load. It moves the focus towards using technology rather than understanding the ideas, the constructs of the lesson. So keep it simple would be the first point here. Lots of platforms are available, so some sort of tool for remote delivery of lessons or remote interactive teaching. Zoom works really very well. If you're in a Microsoft-led school, then Microsoft Teams would be the platform of choice for that with its online video call, and Google Meet fits in really well with Google Classroom. So pick one of the three and stick with it. Get good at using that particular tool. Whichever way you go, some way of setting work, some way of collecting work in seems to be really important. I think Microsoft Teams provides a great platform for that, as does Google Classroom. It's very hard to sort of sit here and compare and contrast the two, but I feel Google Classroom slightly easier to use from both the teachers and the pupils' perspective. Microsoft Teams, perhaps that little bit more flexibility in terms of what else you can bring into it, but there's really not very much in it between the two of them. And then the good old-fashioned learning platform, you know, something like Moodle, if that's how or Firefly, if that's what your school had done back before we went into this really very weird period, then there's no good reason to move away from that. The live interactive teaching is certainly something which can be put into that sort of platform as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Miles. And looking forward to the end of what you call this weird period, and it surely is weird, how will teachers best be able to manage the computing lessons when they get back into the classroom? Because obviously some children will have done more than others when they've been at home. I think it's going to be equally difficult in some ways.
Yeah, I think we saw with the return to school in September, this sense of the need for a catch-up curriculum. You know, the advice from the Department for Education, advice in the sort of statutory guidance mode, was very much about maintaining breadth and balance of the curriculum. So yes, whilst we might prioritise maths and English in terms of the subjects where people really do need to catch back up to the level that we would have expected them to be at, that shouldn't come at the expense of learning across the curriculum. And there are lots of ways of bringing the development of their English and mathematics skills into those other subjects that we teach in both primary and secondary school. So yes, maths and English catch-up really does matter, but that shouldn't be at the expense of other subjects. I'm hopeful that some of what we've seen working well in this period are things which we'll be able to continue with when we're back face-to-face in proper classrooms, or everybody's back face-to-face in proper classrooms. So using computers for setting and marking work, you know, doing more of the work using digital technology, providing recordings of lessons. So there will still be pupils who are away from school, being able to allowing them to be able to watch a recording of at least the introduction to the lesson is something which I think teachers have got used to using the technology for. So continuing to make good and effective use of technology. Also, that opportunity for that independent, more autonomous learning, I'd like to still see some of that happening when we are back in school. But yes, you're right, that the gap between children is likely to have broadened rather than narrowed during this time. And so teachers, I think, will want to focus their attention on those who've really struggled during this period of learning remotely and helping them to catch up. But again, an ambitious, broad, challenging curriculum for all ought to be part of every child's education entitlement, but particularly for those who found it really difficult to continue their education from home.
Thank you very much indeed, Miles. That's all very useful and helpful, I hope, to our audience. And thank you to all of you who've joined the conversation. If you'd like to get in touch with Miles, how best to do that, Miles?
Oh, Twitter is probably the best bet. So I'm at mberry on Twitter. I do have a website at milesberry.net, but I have not been very good at maintaining that recently. There's still some good stuff on there.
Okay, so perhaps best to take the Twitter route. And I hope Miles will be back later in our series to talk about other elements of teaching and the classroom and being at home and all the challenges and opportunities that are available to teachers at the moment. So if you'd like to suggest any other topics you'd like us to cover, please just send them in to us at ICT for Education. You'll find a link on the website. Meantime, thanks again to everybody and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mats.